cooling?
It's cool.
Let's hope so. One of the things I've been seeing a lot on some of the Facebook groups and all is a lot of guys this time of year, especially right now, we're shooting this in the middle of summer.
Yeah.
They're complaining about overheating issues on their classic cars. It's just a perennial problem. We see this a lot. You and I hear from people all the time. They're talking about, hey, my car's not cooling correctly. What's going on? So what we're going to talk about, I think, is going over some of the things that a guy can deal with and maybe how to fix those problems, because sometimes it's going to be so esoteric it's not going to be anything that we say that's going to fix it. But there are some major things to consider when you're having cooling issues in your classic Ford, Chevrolet, Mopar, heck, even an Audi.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. It's all still an internal combustion engine running through a heat exchanger with the water. That's all it really is.
Yeah, it applies to everything.
So one of the first things I guess I want to talk about is going to be the radiator itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
It's the biggest part of the cooling system.
it is the biggest part of the cooling system outside of the water pump, which moves the water for the radiator. Other than it's the biggest thing. One of the things we've run across recently with one of Logan's service trucks is that he thought his radiator was okay because it looked nice.
Yeah, coolant screen. Yeah.
The coolant's green, it looks nice, but in fact the radiator was about half full of schmutz.
Yep. Yeah, so the sediment always goes to the bottom, plugs up cores, plugs up tubes, and bada bing, bada boom, you're on the side of the road.
You can still have good flow through the radiator with that as well.
Yep.
Now in a minute we're going to go and we're going to show you exactly how to do a test on that to see what your cooling is. And the next thing on that I wanted to talk about is coolant drop. And what is the temperature variation supposed to be? You're supposed to be running at about 180, 190, whatever your thermostat is at idle, correct?
Yeah. You should probably want about 20, 30 degrees minimum drop across the radiator.
And that's going to be your deciding factor on things like if you're putting a bigger engine in there or when you got more horsepower. The more horsepower you run, the
hotter the engine, the hotter the coolant gets.
The hotter the engine, the hotter the coolant. So you would want a bigger radiator for that, but we can go into that in just a minute as well. But your biggest consideration on the radiator is it cooling efficiently?
Mm-hmm. And always a bigger radiator isn't always the answer either.
That's true, because a lot of guys will use a radiator and they'll think, well, I'm going to put a 4-core in there.
Yeah, 4-core, thick,
That's going to be it. Thick
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean cooling efficiency, especially if you're like most of us of an age and you're trying to run AC systems and all that, and you have a condenser out in front of it.
Yep.
That's going to even
Just
further slow.
Heats up everything.
Yeah, the condenser, the heat from the condenser, and from the front to the back of the radiator, you're losing efficiency the further out you have to go in order to get that done.
You need a lot of fan to pull through a 4-core radiator.
That's probably going to be a case where we could talk about electric fans for cooling, because then you can get the CFM levels you need in order to pull the air through that 4-core radiator.
Especially at idle.
Especially at idle, because that's where all that's going to be at. And we'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute. All right, so next up in your cooling system is the next most important thing, and that would be your water pump. A good stock water pump is great. One of the things you can run into, and I don't know about this on some of the Chevrolet products, but on Ford products, especially on the 5-liter Mustangs from the 80s and 90s, you have a reverse rotation water pump. Now, you can possibly go down to the auto parts store and get the wrong water pump for your application. You have to be very picky about how that looks and sets up.
And that pretty much comes with a serpentine belt changes, didn't it?
Yeah, when the serpentine belts came in, that's when Ford went to the reverse rotation pump, and I guess they figured it brought better cooling into the engine, so they changed that. So that's something to keep in mind on your Ford products. I don't know that GM or Mopar did anything like that on their water pump flow situation, but I know Ford did, so that's something to look at. You never know, it may be that causing your problems. And as your horsepower goes up and your RPMs possibly increase, because if you're building a hot engine, you're gonna light into it every once in a while and be turning 5,000 RPM. You might consider
a better water pump.
A better water pump, something like a flow cooler or some of these other products. Now, I said flow cooler. Let's hope they're still out there and making lots of money making flow coolers. You never know. But if something like a flow cooler or a high performance water pump is a good idea, just simply because they do work with the impellers, they change things up a little bit, help the flow characteristics of the water pump to get more fluid through, because that is part of that equation. You want to keep the fluids moving. But there is a case where you can have too much.
Yes, too fast is
Too much
not.
and too fast.
Yep.
Now that goes into pulley sizes and things like that, so you might want to look at that as another issue. You may have a pulley set off of something else where somebody just went down to the junkyard and they grabbed a set of pulleys off of a pickup truck because it was there, and your differences between the main pulley on the bottom and your water pump pulley are enough to either slow down or speed up your water pump too much for your application. In my opinion, for what it's worth, I always try to stay, if I'm doing V-belts, with the factory original pulleys for that application. If I'm running a 260, I'm going to put 260 pulleys on there, 283, whatever it is. I'm going to try to keep those pulleys what they originally were because the factory set them up that way if the engine is not too hot.
Yeah.
Now, what can go on the side whenever you're outside of that and you're going too fast? What's going on with the water pump and what's happening that's causing you issues possibly for overheating?
Well, there's a couple things. So if you have, this goes into a later topic, but when you remove a thermostat, flow becomes a really big problem because it pushes coolant too fast through the radiator and doesn't have enough time to actually cool. And I want to say it's a non-positive displacement. So it can actually, if the thermostat's closed, it can deadhead the pump. But if you're spinning high RPMs with a high flow and it's deadheaded, you can cavitate, bubble, whatever you want to say in that, and it's not good for the pump. Pumps don't like cavitation.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's always an issue. Cavitation starts inducing bubbles into the system, which causes
Aeration
occlusion and aeration in the block. Can also cause some heating issues because you'll start getting air pockets
and hot spots.
Yep. One of the reasons I think a lot of the manufacturers in the last several years have gone to a vacuumed system where you have to evacuate all the air out of the system and the cooling system on the
And
cars.
like LS steam ports that are on the top of the cylinder heads, that's for where air pockets happening.
Band-Aid.
Yeah, it's Band-Aid.
It is a Band-Aid, but it's a good Band-Aid. It's not a bad idea. You're mentioning the thermostats. That's a really big deal because some guys won't run a thermostat, but they still will go in and put an orifice reducer in the spot where the thermostat goes. But on the street, run a thermostat.
Yeah, there's no reason not to. If your system isn't working, pulling the thermostat's not going to magically fix it.
It's going to make it worse, possibly.
Yeah.
You could have more problems pulling the thermostat than you have leaving it in there. Usually on most classic muscle car era stuff, 1960 to 1978, let's just say, that stuff's all going to run anywhere between a 160 to a 185 thermostat. And most of the time not going into the 190s, but later engines like the 5-liter Mustangs will run a 190 thermostat on them.
Technically, hotter is better for air mixture and fuel mixture atomization, all that stuff.
I kind of want to move off of that little thing right there for a second to talk about some engine issues that you can have that will cause a cooling problem as well. One of those being too lean a mixture on your fuel.
Yep.
You can go out and find, below me here, there'll be a link to how to check your plugs to make sure your plugs are of the right temperature and you're getting good burn on your plugs. If you're going too rich, that's not going to cause an issue with you overheating. But if you're way too lean, your cylinder heads are getting really, really hot. The GM cylinder heads that we had the other day that we showed you when we pulled the 350 apart, those heads, that engine was running, as you were saying, at one point very rich, but also very, very lean at one point.
Yep. The fuel actually cools the cylinder heads.
Cooling factor of a fuel. Now, this is something. This is going to be off on that same topic. This is the same problem. If you're running 87 in a car, you're not cooling as well. You're not, with octane rating on your engine, the octane rating has very little to do with better fuel, other than the fact that what you're trying to do is the more octane you have, in essence, the cooler your burn is, the more cooling properties, it's a slower burn.
Yep.
So you have a much better chance of keeping that engine cool because it's a high performance engine. So a slower burn is better, and a no pre-detonation is way, way better because that's going to also heat your engine up. If you hear pinging when you're going down the road and you nail that throttle, that is the fuel in your combustion chamber exploding, not burning.
Yep, and your pistons rattling in the holes.
I've had that happen a few times. Some guys can't hear it. My dad was deaf to it. He couldn't hear. He couldn't hear an engine ping.
Yeah.
I could, and I was always driving me nuts with him when we were working on the car. I don't hear it, and I'm like, it's there. Yeah, it's there. That can be something with a certain age. I may go deaf here in the next couple of years. I don't know. Another thing too is timing. If your timing has too much advance in it, a couple of things you'll notice when you start the car up warm, it's going to be very slow to start. You'll hear it, and this is awful, but I'm going to make this noise. It's going to go, whoa, whoa, whoa. And then it might catch and fire and start running. But that tells you that there's just too much timing in the engine. It could also mean you have a battery problem, but more likely it's a timing issue. You might want to back your timing off just a little bit till that kind of disappears. You should have a good, clean rotation on startup without it doing that. And that will also, the timing will feed into what goes on with the plugs and with the mixture in your fuel. All those things can serve to make that engine super hot. So keep in mind on that as well. All right, so we've talked about some of the major things. Now we're going to go into some of the little more esoteric things that can possibly be, things that I've actually run into when working on these cars. An engine that's sat up for a while can have a problem with, it looks fine. Water pump looks fine. No weeping out of the weep hole on the bottom of the water pump. But you can have an issue with the impeller if it sits and it doesn't have coolant in it, or at one point in its life it didn't have coolant in it. The steel impeller in there can actually rust away.
Or if it's straight water.
Yeah, and people will do that.
Yeah.
People will put straight water in them. I've seen a lot of that happen before. We had a friend of mine, Bob Oswald, Oswald's Classic Mustangs up here in Batesburg, had a Mustang that had a cooling issue. He couldn't figure it out. He did change the radiator, did all the usual suspects. You know, fresh coolant, new radiator, made sure the hoses weren't plugged, all that stuff. And he couldn't figure it out. It kept overheating. He didn't know why. Then, and I think it was overheating at highway speed, which that's a good indication. If it's at highway speed, it's probably a water pump issue or something within the block.
Airflow, yeah.
Airflow. And that can be an airflow issue as well. So he finally, just out of pure abject frustration, pulled the water pump off, and he noticed rust on the bottom edge of the inside of the plate. He pulled the plate off, and the impeller was almost completely missing.
It'll happen.
Put a brand new water pump, stock water pump back on there, no overheating problems at all at speed.
Yep. Yeah. Water's not meant for cooling systems.
No, and I mean, that's really a weird thing to say, but you're right. And I'll be honest with you anymore, I used to be a guy that I wanted to do my own mix. Yeah. But anymore,
it's not worth it.
It's not worth it. They make the 50-50 coolant. You don't have to worry about the water and coolant mixture.
You might save $2 a gallon.
Yeah, it's not even that much money you're saving for having the knowledge that they have a perfect mix in that bottle.
Yep.
So that's a tip for you. There's not really anything directly about the cooling problems, but if you're going to do it, just buy the 50-50 coolant and be done with it, because you're more likely to get what you need out of it and make a right what you put in the radiator. Because, man, you want to start a fist fight in a room full of car guys, tell them you should use distilled water. Or just go ahead and use tap water.
Use hose water.
Woo! Yeah, it came out of the hose. We drank it when we were kids. Why not, right?
It's good enough for me. It's good enough for thee.
But that's not really necessarily true. All right, another thing that you can have that's kind of an oddball one, that's one that I've run into, is coolant loss. On the classic cars, and I don't care who it is, Mopar, Chevrolet, Ford, none of them had coolant recovery systems on them. And it's a good idea, if you can at all afford it, to put a coolant recovery system on the car, because it's just going to pull the coolant back into the radiator
once it cools off and makes a vacuum.
Yeah, and so that's a great way to keep track of that. Plus, it's better for the environment if you're worried about that sort of thing.
But also on the coolant loss, if you have a small leak or something, that is causing pressure drop on your cooling system. If your cooling system can't build to full pressure, the coolant boils sooner. So,
isn't there a way you can check that too? I mean, if it's cold, you should pull the cap off and you should get...
Depends. It should be ambient when it's cool to ambient temperature, but the best way is just a pressure tester. You should be able to
buy those out at the auto parts store.
You
can
rent one and not even have to buy it.
Okay.
Most of the systems run 13 to 16 psi, so just look at your cap, pressure test to that. If it loses pressure in under 30 minutes, you got a leak somewhere.
And that's going to be a problem no matter what, because again, that's a coolant issue as well, because you're not having a fully tightened system. So it can create issues, and that will also possibly give you a better indication if you have a head gasket problem, which we're going to talk about in just a second.
Yeah, it's a bad day.
Bad day. We have a bad day out in the yard.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that a lot of guys don't think about that is something that I find to be pretty important is a fan shroud.
Yeah, huge.
Especially if you're in the southeast and you're running in temperatures where you're in the plus 90s,
Yep.
you know, in the summertime, which is when we're all running these cars. At low speed, you're not getting a lot of draw from the radiator. You're just pulling air in from everywhere.
Around.
Yeah, and that can be a real issue. If you can at all, do it, add a fan shroud. And we're going to go over to Studio A here in just a second and take a look at what Ford did back in the day, and then we're going to pop back in here and show you the 72, which is a more advanced thought process on cooling efficiencies. And again, the fan itself is another problem in that, and having too small a fan, having those
Flex fans.
flex fans, flex fans can pull though. I mean, the Ford original ones, you could get some some serious amount of air out of a Ford flex fan from back in the day, but they were just incredibly noisy, and they were prone to popping the blades off. The ones that you can buy at the auto parts stores that are the small quote-unquote high-performance fans, they don't work that well. They don't do the job that you need them to do unless you're drag racing. If you're drag racing, that fan will work just fine for most any application. But on the street, when you're out there running in the heat, it's going to be a problem. And we'll show you what you should have in a fan relationship when we go out and talk about the 64 Falcon hardtop in just a second. All right, so here we got basically a Ford cooling system. This is pretty standard for a lot of the manufacturers. Now, Chevrolet didn't do one thing Ford did do on these early cars, and that is the return hose is on the same side as the flow hose coming in. I don't like that, and I typically try to take these and move them over to a cross-flow system because it just buys you, again, a little bit more time for cooling across that. This radiator will be fine up to probably a mildly warmed over 302, but once you get past that, you're going to need to open up your core support opening here and go with a bigger, possibly a later model Mustang radiator. Because you're just going to need, again, more time, more space, more cooling. I've put a long time ago, I put a sacrificial anode inside this cap so that it doesn't do the electrolysis thing inside the engine. It helps with that from what I've understood. We'll see. I haven't popped this thing in a while, but we haven't had any cooling issues on this engine, so I think we're good to go. When we put the AC system on here from Classic Auto Air years ago, I also went in and I put their fan. This is a factory Ford heavy-duty cooling package radiator fan shroud for a Mustang. Same thing as a Falcon. Plus, I put the 6-blade fan that you would get for AC. Again, you're trying to up your efficiencies and make things run a little bit better. There's not really a problem on this one with any kind of air dam issue. This sits really tight up to the core support. The only issue we do have is that the condenser is the size
of the radiator.
There's no air getting around that condenser in any other fashion other than right through it. This is a 3-row radiator. Like I said, I haven't had any cooling problems, but we're sticking with the 260 for a little while on this thing. So that's not going to be an issue. When we move over to the 347 in this car, we will need to upgrade the radiator and possibly move to a different fan system on here in order to keep the thing cool. That is going to be a big consideration for what we do with it. So this does work though. I mean, you still have good flow through here. Again, all you want to do is be able to stick your hand back here when the engine is running, and you're going to get a really good, strong airflow across here because of the fact that it's a 6-blade fan.
And it's a fixed fan.
And it's a fixed fan, and it's going to be loud.
Yes.
It's gonna, like we've talked about, it's going to be a lot of nerves.
Sounds like a plane.
Sounds like an airplane taking off. So when you start, giving a little bit of throttle, you're mostly going to hear a fan out of this thing until I put the glass pack on it. And then you'll hear the glass pack. But you'll still hear this, possibly even over the glass
Depends on which end of the car you're standing on.
It depends on which end of the car you're on. All right, so let's go look at the 72 Ford truck and get out of this heat because it is hot in here. All right, so we've looked at the Falcon. Now we're going to look at this thing. This is a more advanced cooling system, only by like a half hour.
Yeah.
So what we've got is we've got a very big radiator on this, and the trucks are typical for this because you do a lot more hauling and towing with them. So they're going to put a bigger radiator in it. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about at first with high-performance engines. So you've got a bigger radiator. You have a fan shroud on here. These all came with fan shrouds. If your truck does not have a fan shroud, it had a fan shroud whenever it was new. They have a fan shroud on it, and on this one has a thermostatic fan on it. And we talked a little bit about, we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but a thermostatic fan should have some resistance to it dead cold. It shouldn't just freewheel. You shouldn't be able to take it and spin it and it just keep rotating after you've done a fling like that. This one is in really good shape. It works very, very well. We've put it to the test quite a few times. Also on here, you'll notice that the fan is sticking further out. There's much more fan on the outside of the shroud, and that's important because that creates more of a vortex for flow. You should be able to sit here at the idle when this thing's at temperature, put your hand back here and get a lot of air coming off that fan at idle. One little thing that this thing doesn't have that I'd like to see on this truck is there should be a plate across here. And there's actually holes up here, it looks like, for you to have a shield on top of the radiator to help direct that flow. But working better would be for the shield to actually be down here, because that's going to just direct the flow even better into the radiator. This one has a condenser on it, so that cuts your cooling efficiency a little bit, because the condenser is something that the air has to go through even if it's not running. But if you're running the AC,
it's putting heat into the air that's then being drawn through the radiator.
Right, so then you have that same problem we were talking about. This is not anything more than a 3-row radiator.
Yep.
And that's all you really need in a case like this, is just a 3-row radiator. It's got plenty of area on it, lots of time, because basically the bigger your radiator, what you're really doing is buying time.
Yep.
You're buying time for it to cool it from up here to down there.
Slowing down the circulation.
Exactly, because you've got more volume, you're pulling more water through, and I think that was one of the reasons on some of the Galaxies that they ran the tank, the reserve tank up on top. It just gave you that little bit more capacity for cooling. Okay, so you got a cooling problem. And let's say your cooling problem is at idle. You come up to a stoplight in a traffic, in your 90-degree day, and you watch your temperature slowly rise. What is your procedure for going in and checking that out to make sure what the problem is? And I know it's a low. We know it's a low-speed problem.
First thing, coolant level, and then check your fan. Make sure it's actually spinning up. If you have a thermatic fan, you need to make sure that it's actually engaging when it's hot, because they can look like they're spinning, but they're really not.
Exactly. And what you want to do with that is you want to mark the thermostat or the piece on the shaft. Mark the shaft and see. It doesn't have to be spinning at the same speed, but it can't be just freewheeling.
Yeah. And also, if you rev it, you should definitely hear the fan. If you rev it and you don't hear fan, or it's just real mild, you got a problem. Especially if you have like a fixed blade or a aggressive pitch fan, you should definitely hear that thing trying to take off.
Yeah, the Falcon's like that. I mean, when you start that thing up, it's got I think we got a 6 or a 5-blade fan for the AC systems on those cars. That fan's the same way. I mean, you hear it whenever
it sounds like running. A prop plane.
Maybe we put one of those whistling death things like the Corsair had on them on that fan. Okay, so you want to check that. Now, where do we go from there?
Next, you're going to be looking at coolant flow, which is water pump, thermostat. Thermostat sitting at idle is kind of, doesn't have to open much to cool much at that point, so it's less of a chance, but same with water pump, really.
And you should always check your thermostats before you throw them in there, too.
Yeah.
You want to put them in a pot of water that's 200 degrees, and you should watch that thing open at about 190. It should be, by 200, it should be open.
Yeah.
That's one thing I've read that a lot of guys are encountering out there in the hobby right now, is that they'll get thermostats, and they're just not working.
Yep.
I don't know how normal that is out there in the world, but it's always a good idea to check the parts before you throw them in the hole.
Yeah, that's a very critical part that doesn't take much time to check.
No, you know, just don't let the wife know. You know, when she's not home, put it in a pot of boiling water and see what happens. And if you could do it where you can check your temperatures, if it's at 190 and the temperature in the pot, and you put the thing in there, you'll know it opens up. Or you can put it in there before and watch the temperatures come up and watch it open, just to make sure that it's operating correctly. All right, so what's next? I mean, so we've checked those things. What else do we need to look at for low-speed stuff?
Really, the only other thing would be checking temperatures across the radiator to make sure you don't have sediment plugging and that it's cooling enough across the radiator.
Now, how would I do that? Let me. I'm going to go grab this Galaxy radiator. I'll be right back.
Sure, set that on your phone so you break the screen.
I thought about that before I did it. Yeah, let me treat that like I should, right? Okay, so we've got a radiator. We are on the engine side of the radiator. This is a 1963 Galaxy radiator. You'll note that it doesn't have an inlet on the top up here. It's actually a tank that it works off of up on top of the engine.
Yep.
Now, so I'm going to go check this with a digital thermometer, LED, whatever, not LED.
Laser pyrometer.
Laser pyrometer. And you can get those down at
Harbor Freight.
You can get them at AutoZone, Lowe's. Everybody carries those things now. So I'm checking it. What do I want to do?
So you're going to be looking, the first thing you want to do is go to the inlet and see what the inlet temperature is to get a baseline. And then the heat should dissipate basically in a radius from the inlet to the outlet. The outlet should be the coldest, and then the inlet's going to obviously be the hottest.
And you should have a 20-degree drop from here to down there.
Yep.
This should be right at what your thermostat's opening point is, right?
And this whole tank, generally speaking, is going to be hot close to the inlet, but the lower you go down the tank, the cooler it will get.
And if you're really, really cold, if you're colder than a 20-degree difference, like if you're, say you're at 250 up here and you're at 140 down here at the bottom, you know you've probably got sediment in the bottom of the radiator, right?
Yeah.
The radiator, this section of the radiator, for whatever level, if it starts getting cold from here down, like really cold, you know you've probably got a sediment problem.
Pretty much if you have a sudden jump anywhere in it, that's a problem area. Because it should all gradually decrease or increase, whichever way you go. So
you say, and like I said, 20-degree difference between this port and that port.
Yeah, and that's just a guideline.
And that's going to be a problem even at speed.
Yeah.
If you are out and you go out and run it and you go out and check it after you've run it, if it's still doing that at speed and you're still having high-speed issues, it could be a problem with the radiator. Again, I'm going to go back to what Logan was dealing with the service truck he was running at the time. Even at highway speeds, it says it's overheating, and that tells me, I'm like, that doesn't make sense because it should have plenty of flow across the radiator. So I told him it's probably the radiator. And people elsewhere told him it was a head gasket problem.
On the exhaust side.
On the exhaust
because it was
side,
hot.
Because it was hot. Can't make this stuff up, folks. All right, I want to pull this back out of here, and we're going to kind of soldier on with a running issue. As far as, like, you know, if you have a problem with it while you're running down the road. I'll set this over here and damage the paint on the Camaro because we're cool like that. All right, so I'm not having a problem at idle, or maybe I am still having a problem at idle, but I'm also having a problem at highway speeds. It's just generally after a little while it gets too hot. What are my procedures there?
So my first thing is airflow. My car, 66 Mustang, it was horrible at highway speed of overheating until we had the Shelby front valence put on it. And that increases airflow dramatically. And actually, before that, I cut out the license plate area on the front valence. And that solved the problem, 90% of the problem.
Right.
So airflow is a big thing at highway speed. And also air getting out of the engine bay is a big problem as well. Because if you have an air dam behind the radiator at highway speed, air can't go through it.
Yeah, and the Mustangs, Fairlanes, anything with a shock tower like that double A-arm system that those cars use, they have that shock tower that is right there before the back half of the engine. And it's going to impede airflow across that. Yeah,
that's a big highway problem, concern. But then also, like we just said, coolant flow through the radiator is a big thing as well.
That's probably going to be, I would think coolant flow through the radiator is probably your biggest problem and the thing that you're going to want to look at and say, okay, maybe it's a radiator issue. If a guy pulls all that stuff off and he's still having problems, he's probably got an issue in the engine, I would think. If he's having a coolant problem and the radiator doesn't fix it.
Head gaskets can be a big concern then, because in the later life of my car's engine, head gaskets were a problem.
Because you'll start seeing more steam out of the exhaust pipes.
It'll overpressurize the coolant, and it looks like it's boiling, but it's actually compression gas exiting through the radiator, which is not good.
Now, how can you check that? I mean, what's a safe way to check that? Obviously, if you start the engine up and you take the dead cold, and you take the radiator cap off dead cold,
and it builds pressure right away, EEA.
You're done. You've got a head gasket issue.
Otherwise, you can get block checker from many auto parts stores, which is just a chemical fluid that you put on the reservoir cap, and it pulls the gases out of the radiator And if the fluid changes colors, you're about to spend a lot of money.
So those are all your basics on what you should do, all the checks you need to make, things you need to look out for, because a lot of people don't consider timing and other issues like timing, fuel mixture, things like that, possible problems with the impeller on the water pump. You could even have a case, and this happens more on Fords, and it used to happen a lot more than it does now because the companies have started marking the head gaskets for front, but you could flip the head gaskets on them, and it would cover up one of the ports on the cylinder head
and not flow water.
And it wouldn't flow water, and then you would have an overheating problem on the engine. Let's not go into how I know that on a personal level, because I do know it on a personal level. Well, is there anything else you can think of that we need to talk about?
Run good coolant. That's a major
Oh
thing.
yeah. Don't. I mean, man, this is almost like that same fist fight in a room full of car guys thing.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have people will tell you this brand sucks, that brand sucks. Don't use this. Use this.
It's more so run actual either ethylene glycol or real coolant, not just water. Ethylene glycol absorbs more heat, more BTUs than water can.
Yes.
But water can give off more BTUs. So if you run straight water, the coolant system can't absorb as many BTUs from the engine as the actual coolant can. So that's why another reason that's 50-50 mix. If you run straight concentrate, you can't give off as much heat as it can absorb.
Right.
So you end up just heat soaking, and then overheating. Whereas coolant,
I would think there's probably a lot of people out there that would work under the assumption that, hey, if I just put straight coolant in here and no water mix, it'll cool better.
Yep. One of my friends worked for an armored car company, and they were doing that. They put straight concentrate in it, and they were running like Crown Vics that were armored, 4-core radiators, and it just kept overheating. They couldn't figure it out, and that was the cause. They would get 30 minutes of run time out of it down the road, and it would just start slowly creeping, and they couldn't figure it out. And coolant fixed it.
And the problem of the water thing, for a final thought on that, is it can also start creating a rust issue in the engine. If your radiator cap pops off and there's goo and particulate on the radiator cap, that means you got an engine that didn't get the right amount of coolant or the right mix of coolant.
And that's the top of the radiator. The bottom of the radiator looks worse.
And that's where you start running the thing we were talking about with checking the radiator for a coolant or a cooling change that's pretty dramatic. That's probably what's going to be happening is you have rust down the side of there. Coolant is important on these engines, and people don't really seem to understand that. But some people don't seem to understand that. But then again, some of the photos you've shown me in the last couple of days about things that you're running into with your mobile mechanic business.
A lot of people don't understand a lot of stuff. Don't epoxy fuel lines, folks. It's not good for stuff.
Just say no to epoxy. All right, folks. That's our show for this week. You guys do me a favor. Be kind to each other. Love each other. Treat each other nice. We'll see you next time on Autorestomod. Yeah, so I'm going to let you do the things you need to do with your day. You know what? We got to talk about this, though. We really both need some new shirts.
Yeah.
This one, the lettering's coming off of it.
Yeah, mine's
You put a hole in it.
Yeah, mine's holy with the wrong lettering.
You need to be more holy, but not this kind of
Yeah.
got stains.
Yeah, no, they don't come out.
I need to keep your shirts here.
Another
so you
one
don't
of
just
mine.
wear them.
Yeah, another one of mine's UV baked on half of it. Yeah.
Because we left it outside for 3 days, and the UV said, "Ooh."
That's good. I'll have 14 more of them.
Do you have any more of those shit? All right, folks. See you later.